Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and this video contains AI. I'm real, my opinions are real, but these typewriter manuals might not be. Now, typewriter repair is a very difficult and intimidating thing to tackle. There are plenty of resources out there on the internet between fantastic YouTube channels, really helpful websites, and great Facebook groups and social media pages there to help you as you tackle your repair. But sometimes people want a beginner's guide, and I work with a lot of beginners on Instagram for fixing little problems on their typewriters. And I think a lot of people just want some sort of really easy to understand written instruction manual for how to tackle a typewriter. But there's quite a few problems with that, including that every brand has a different way of doing something, every machine within that brand line has a different way of doing something, and a lot of typewriter repair, at least in my experience, is really going to be based on your own experiences with working on typewriters, learning from other machines, applying it other places, and also learning from professionals or seasoned repair techs. These manuals that we're going to talk about today, I don't know specifically if they are AI generated, but there's a few things about them that make me think that they may have been an AI summary of how to tackle some sort of typewriter repair. And AI is a very difficult topic to talk about on this channel. I've made a few other AI pieces of content before where I've played with ChatGPT to help me discover the best typewriter for me, as well as a video where I used an AI app and algorithm to help me while thrifting, identifying antiques and different items. I received quite a bit of backlash on both of those videos for talking about AI. I understand for analog collectors and people who like typewriters, AI is something that is totally against everything that you stand for. And I also do not have a positive opinion of using AI. For context, I do work in education, and last semester I graded 70 essays in a row that all had some sort of AI generated content in them. It's a little bit demoralizing, but I don't think that shutting down or not being aware of what's out there is a way to go about it. I personally get really upset when I watch AI videos on the internet and I don't know they're AI. It feels like I'm being tricked. So I wanted to look at these manuals that I found so that I could review them for you. And in case you're thinking about making some sort of purchasing decision about getting an easy cleaning guide or repair guide for a typewriter, you know what you're getting into and you don't purchase something without knowing what kind of content is in that book. So this is not endorsing AI. This is not endorsing you buying a product that is AI generated, but I also don't want to totally condemn the use of AI because I do think it can be a tool. Will I use it? Probably not. I don't use it currently because I have that perspective on it. But I also hope that you don't leave this video thinking that I'm some evil machine promoting other evil machines. I just wanted to go through the process of looking at these so you have some more context and more information. That's all this is. Please stay. So a few months ago, I was on the Antique Typewriter Collectors Facebook group, and someone posted a screenshot from a typewriter manual that they had found on Amazon that they perceived to be based on AI content. I looked into it, I found which book they were talking about, and I added it to my Amazon list, and then completely forgot that it was there. But as I went back to find that AI manual, I found like 5 other books that had very similar covers, very similar descriptions, and that all looked like they were some sort of AI-generated piece of content. So here are the titles that I did purchase. I purchased them in a Kindle version, and it's a really good thing that I did that, and we'll get to that reason in a minute. The first was the Vintage Typewriter Guide, How to Buy, Restore, and Care for Classic Machines with Step-by-Step Instructions by Orson Whitfield. Vintage Typewriter Collecting, a comprehensive guide to the history, models, and restoration for enthusiasts by Neil Parker. How to repair and maintain vintage typewriters, an easy guide for beginners to fix, clean, and care for typewriters at home by Jamison Keys. Old Typewriter Repair Manual, Step-by-Step Restoration Techniques for Classic and Antique Machines by Mateo Lewis. How to Collect, Restore, and Repair Mechanical Typewriters, Beginner's Step-by-Step Manual by Jack Coleman. Vintage Typewriter Restoration and Maintenance, a step-by-step manual for cleaning, repairing, and reviving the timeless machines by Henry Aldridge. All of these manuals have very similar titles, very similar descriptions, and they all have authors that have very little else published on Amazon. As I was going through and looking at these, some of them have very obviously AI-generated covers. When I was working with ChatGPT to develop typewriter images in a video to visualize my favorite machine, one thing I noticed about when they're generating typewriter images is they get a lot of details wrong, including the text on the keys. So the individual lettering on the keys is always messed up. It always looks like a little swirl or it's in the wrong order. So this cover in particular stood out to me. Now this doesn't mean that the text was AI generated, but it does mean that the cover was AI generated. So I definitely noticed a few things like that as I was purchasing these books. Another thing that I did while I was looking through all of these texts is I clicked on the author's name in Amazon to see if they had any other published materials. I think only one of them actually had a bunch of other manuals for similarly complicated processes like clock repair and furniture restoration listed on Amazon, and everything else took me to a very strange generic list of just random books, none of which were related to the author, and all of them seemed to have pretty similar suggestions, which I thought was kind of weird. The other thing that I noticed is that none of these authors have an Amazon page for their specific author page. Now, when you're buying something on Amazon, you can click on the author's name and see where their storefront is and see if they've published anything else. Often it also has some sort of bio in it. There were no pages for these guys, so I then went to Google. I Googled all of these authors' names, and I found a few interesting results. None of them are the names of authors that I could find. The first one that I noticed was that Lewis and Whitfield, two of those authors, were musicians that were listed on Google. Coleman is a character on a TV show, but there's also an author with this same name. As far as I can tell, it's not the same guy because he uses his middle initial in all of his texts. Keyes is a Fortune 500 business owner, but has a different spelling of his name. And there is an author named Neil Parker, but he lives in Maine and he writes about boats. So I don't think it's him. I also looked up all of their names in the Antique Typewriter Collectors group on Facebook. This is not a comprehensive list of every typewriter collector that's ever existed, but if someone's willing to write a manual about typewriter repair, there's a likelihood that they might be interested in typewriters beyond this manual, and they might belong to some sort of social media group where they would talk about typewriters. I will say a lot of them also listed other resources that you might have for typewriter collecting and repair, and a lot of them do mention that there are social media groups for typewriter collectors. None of them appeared as names in the Typewriter Collectors group. If maybe one of them had come up, I might feel like, oh, there's a chance that these aren't just AI, but all of them came up as missing from the Typewriter Collectors group. So before I go any further, I do not know if these are officially, for 100% sure, AI-generated content. But the details that I'm going to list throughout the rest of the video lead me to believe that these are not written by a human being, or at least not completely written by a human being. So that's my nice little disclaimer. I encourage you to do your own research as you're looking at this. This is also for review purposes, educational, and not a critique on anyone's writing, I guess I should say, because I don't write anything. So the first thing that I did was go through and look at all of their table of contents. One of them didn't have a table of contents, it just started talking about typewriters, and the rest of them all had very similarly formatted content pages. Now that could just be because it's a Kindle version, it might look different somewhere else, but something else that I noticed was all of them had some sort of disclaimer statement at the beginning of their text, and they were almost word for word exactly the same in all of these books. So this one comes from the Aldridge book. There is a copyright page that attributes it to 2025 to the author. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be copied, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronical, mechanical, photocopying, regarding or otherwise without prior written permission of the publisher. Unauthorized reproduction, distribution, and posting of this material online or elsewhere is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. I did attempt to contact the author, but I couldn't find them on the internet and I didn't know that they exist. One other thing that I found interesting, and this is only in the Aldridge copyright page, is he also includes this statement. Henry Aldridge asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this book. What does that mean? Like, if you wrote it, why would you have to state that you have the moral right to claim it as your own text? A few of them also include the statement, except in the case of brief quotations used in critical reviews or articles. So this is going to be a review. Please don't sue me. I don't have money for that. So all of those copyright pages are very similar. The content areas also seem to be very similar. Lewis, Aldridge, and Keyes all had very similar sections. Most of them had some sort of dedicated section to your workplace setup and the type of tools that you need for typewriter repair. It makes sense because I'm asked all the time about what kind of tools I might need to work on a typewriter, but also like the moral perspective. One of them mentioned that you should have a place on your desk to put your typewriter of pride to make yourself feel better. Just felt a little strange. So all of them have sections about workplace setup and typewriter tools. I then went through all of these texts and started to look at the individual pages. I read everything in all of these. There are no pictures or diagrams in any of these texts. Each chapter is less than a couple pages long, and a lot of the headings that they have listed in their table of contents result in only a paragraph of information. And that's the same across almost all of these texts. So let's start with the Keyes novel, or manual. So the first thing that I noticed in looking at Keyes' manual, they do go through the different types of typewriters, and they list out manual, electric, and portable as the 3 categories of typewriters. I do feel like this is missing a few. Now, obviously, ultra portable isn't an actual classification of typewriters. This is something I've been learning on the internet, but it is a way that we look at smaller typewriters with plastic cases that are completely enclosed. We would call those lightweight or featherweight portables. You have your larger manual portables, you have your electrics, but you also have your desk standard. And I feel like that isn't really considered here. They just list it as manual, but manual is not electrified, not so much the size of the typewriter. I will say also that Aldridge claims the same 3 categories in their chapter 2, so some similarities are starting to appear. Oh, I found this funny. In the foreword, before getting into the text of the actual book, they mention these machines teach patience in a world of instant gratification. And if this is AI-generated text, I find that very ironic. Something else that they did mention throughout the text was that you could use your serial number to identify the age of your machine in the typewriter database, which is true, and I have a video on that. But as I looked at the serial number they put in the book for identifying the machine that they had listed, it didn't match up. It had the wrong amount of letters for the machine that they were referencing. And this does tip me off a little bit to it being AI generated, because I did find that when I was using ChatGPT a couple years ago to look into typewriter information, it had trouble giving me accurate numbers and accurate sources. So it might state something and it seems legit, but if you know anything about the topic, you can start to pick apart some of those things. AI is a learning machine. It is learning every time you input it, and it does respond to you giving it feedback. So it might state something, you can correct it, and it'll know for next time. But if you don't know anything about that topic, you don't know to correct it in the first place. In step-by-step assembly, the first step is taking out the ribbon, followed by removing all of the key tops, which is only described in a singular paragraph. I find that to be really weird to be your second step, and also it doesn't describe the difference between removing plastic keycaps on something like a Smith Corona from the 1950s or 60s and a glass top keycap that you might have on a 1920s machine. Those are very different processes, and even some of the plastic key tops have specific pins in them that you can't remove when you are removing that key. They will break as you remove them. Maybe you would need to read different sections or a different section specifically for removing key tops, and it's definitely not something that I would put as a simple second step. They also have a section on removing the carriage under this section of disassembly. They have 3 steps for removing carriages. The first is to locate the carriage release lever. Then move the carriage all the way to one side. Look underneath, you'll see a small retaining clip or screw that holds the carriage onto the machine. Carefully unscrew or unclip these fasteners. The carriage should lift off smoothly. If it resists, stop and double check for hidden screws. Never force it. There are definitely machines that I've worked on where this is not that simple of a process, and even on the ones that do have a easily removable carriage system in one go, is also not that easy, and it's different on every single model. So that is evidence of a larger problem that I found across all of these, is that they are really oversimplified. They give everything in 3 steps, which sounds really good, but as you get into a project and you find yourself running into all the little intricate details on a typewriter, 3 steps is not enough, especially when you don't have diagrams or photos to follow along with. It does actually give you more steps on how to set up your space than it does on disassembly and reassembly of the machines. I thought that was disproportionate because, yes, setting up a workspace is important, being safe is obviously very, very important, but taking apart a typewriter has more steps than that. But one thing I found really weird in looking at this is they mention or have a whole chapter dedicated to the process of valuing your typewriter. Now, this is something I do differently than just about everybody else I've interacted with. As a collector, I do not collect based on value, and I also have some weird personal ideals for why I save certain machines and why I don't, and I have a price range for what I do in all of the work that I do. And I know that's very different than everybody else, or at least than a lot of people who collect typewriters, but one thing that I thought was super weird was this emphasis on the authenticity of the parts in your typewriter and not affecting the value of the machine. And I didn't just see it in Key's work, I saw it in all of the manuals that I reviewed. There was always a section or a comment about how you want to check the originality and authenticity of all of the parts and pieces of your machine because that will impact its value. Now, this is something I haven't personally dealt with. I replace screws and springs on typewriters all the time, but I'm also only selling them for $55 to $65. So it's not something that pops up on my radar as an important part of the machine. I usually am just looking for them to work, and most of the time it's not even to work well. It's just to operate. So I did want to see if that is something that other collectors interact with or have trouble with, because it's not something I personally experience. So I went to Facebook and I made a post asking you guys if the authenticity or originality of all of the parts, the springs and the screws mattered to you as a collector. And I have results. So here's what a few of you said in relation to that post. Someone said, obviously, I don't need any more not working typewriters, which I understand. I also saw someone mention that a lot of the machines in their collection are older anyways, and it's impossible to find ones that haven't been serviced in some way, but a lot of those services could have been done as a factory refinish. There were machines that were refinished in the original factory or done by some sort of service professional. There are a lot of people who say that it doesn't matter to them if it's been messed with as long as it operates and works, that functionality seems to be a more important factor to them. This one is interesting. I'd rather have a junked machine that's original, that I can restore or modify to my liking, than something someone else made theirs. But I can see others liking pre-done machines. So I get that perspective as well, that maybe if someone customized what they were doing and it's not to your liking, especially with like paint jobs, that might be something that sets you away. And then this one really, it stood out to me because it makes a lot of sense. So this person said, I generally don't mind cosmetic refinishing and feel that it's often a bonus. I see this rarely enough that if I consider it a novelty rather than damage, though it is sometimes both. It's part of the story, like an owner's name inscription or rebuilding a company's logo or a service tag. So service tags, I've gotten people's serial numbers or social security numbers written on typewriters before, a tag from a factory, my little painted nail polish patches on typewriters. That is part of the story of the machine. But where this person does take issue with non-original parts is when it is a spring that is clearly not the right width or tension or weight, or if it's a screw with different threads put into the machine that ruins the threads in there for any other replacement. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And I didn't even think about that because I just pick whatever fits and go with it. But having the wrong threads in a screw that you've replaced on a machine can cause further issue, as well as having a spring that's not the right spring for that machine. It can cause certain things not to work. I've run into what we call weak springs on machines before, which is where it doesn't have enough tension or weight to do the job it's supposed to do, and that can cause your machine not to operate correctly. So that made a lot of sense to me, even though I don't often think about the originality or authenticity when working on a typewriter. And then this one, also a good point. There's a bit of a ship of Theseus paradox to it. At what point of replacing original parts is it no longer the same machine? That's a good question. So a lot of these were things that I agreed with or I hadn't thought about but make sense to me. But I don't think that that is what these books are trying to state. I think a lot of what they're saying makes sense if you think about collecting classic cars, or my other hobby, collecting Coach bags. Those do seem to matter for originality and authenticity. In Coach bags, for example, we check the serial number to make sure it's actually produced in a factory that was owned by Coach. There are tons of fake bags that are made out of not great materials that don't hold up as well, that are pretending to be that brand. And so the serial number does matter. And in cars, I've watched enough American Pickers to know that they want the engine serial number to match the body serial number, because that means it's how it came out of the factory. I haven't personally experienced that on typewriters, and they don't serial number every part in a typewriter, so it doesn't seem to be as heavy of a consideration when you are buying or valuing a machine. But that could depend on the type of typewriter you are working with. Something much, much older with a higher value than the machines that I'm buying in my collection may have that as a consideration or factor. And someone did mention that it might matter in museum pieces. I have no experience with that. So it's something I didn't think about, but I also don't think it's enough to be included in an easy, beginner-friendly guide. I think that sets unrealistic expectations. What's the next one I read? Aldridge. So this one, I was already set off a little bit because he mentioned he's the moral author of this text, and that rubbed me the wrong way. So I might not have taken notes that were as unbiased as the other ones. The first thing that stood out to me is that he mentioned that you can identify the brand of your machine, and some machines are more likely to have common issues than others. He specifically mentioned that some brands are known for more sticky keys than others. Is that true? I haven't personally experienced that, but has anybody else run into that or know what brand he's talking about? Because he doesn't give an example. I've now had a Tippa and an Adler Contessa in the same body style. Both of them have had broken cases around the screws that hold the top cover in. So to me now I see a pattern, and that seems to be more likely to break on those. But I wouldn't say that I've noticed that some keys are stickier than others, because that is based on people putting oil where it doesn't belong or dust getting where it doesn't belong. I don't know if that's the brand's fault. The disassembly chapter was only a few paragraphs long, and as someone who has done a light amount of typewriter repair, I wouldn't say a lot. I've spent the last 8 or 9 years working on machines, and it's waxed and waned on how confident I am in those skills. But I definitely worked on more than someone who's never worked on one. And I can tell you the disassembly process definitely takes more than 3 or 4 paragraphs to explain, and it is different for every single machine. So I don't think it can be so easily summarized, but that's a personal critique of this, not so much a mention of it being AI or not. Similarly, they had some other things that stood out to me as just something that oversimplifies, or in some cases overcomplicates an issue. This one, for example, it mentions that faint lettering after a replaced ribbon is a misalignment or a typing slug cleaning issue. But it also can be a ribbon that's been installed inappropriately. So you just have it in the wrong placement, or you have it on a stencil setting. The amount of times that I've done that, gone to test it, and nothing shows up on the page because it's set to white, it's usually that for me, or I just have the ribbon in the feeders wrong. Some of them feed from underneath, some of them feed from the top. You have to get it in the ribbon vibrator in a specific way. If you forgot to take pictures of how your ribbon goes through the vibrator, you can find pictures online all the time. I go to the typewriter database, I go to eBay, and I look at how their ribbons are installed if I can't remember how it goes back in there. But also, if it doesn't work one way, I usually just flip it and try it a different way, or mess with that ribbon install before I would assume that it's something like a misalignment. There is one paragraph on escapement cleaning. That is not thorough enough if you genuinely have an escapement problem. And again, there are just also no diagrams throughout the entire course of this. As they're explaining things, they don't go into detail, they don't provide any kind of pictorial representation. Something else, they had a useful community section, which I thought was helpful. They mentioned both Duane from Phoenix Typewriter, and then they mentioned Jot Typewriters, which I read as Jot and Tittle Typewriter, which is a great YouTube channel and has an Instagram as well, but that's not their name. It's not just Jot Typewriter, so I did look it up to see if it was somebody else. It's not. I will also say that I don't want to say I'm slightly offended, but I was not mentioned as a helpful resource. Neither was Hot Rod Typewriter, neither was Joe Van Cleve, neither was Lucas from Typewriter Chicago. And in my experience, those guys are the ones that have helped me out a lot. Obviously, Duane from Phoenix Typewriter is the go-to, the most amazing repair videos, but there are other people in the typewriter community and on YouTube that make content that can help you. So I thought the list was not extensive enough. And I promise I'm not bitter, because I wasn't mentioned in anybody's list. Editing Sarah here. I know that I just mentioned Duane from Phoenix Typewriter and how fantastic he is as a resource. I filmed this video before the news of his unfortunate passing broke, and I'm filming this clip the day after that news came out. Obviously, I'm very saddened to hear this. He was such a great resource and support to me as a typewriter collector and hack tech. It's very sad, and my thoughts go to his family. I didn't want to remove mentioning him from this resource list because I still think his YouTube channel is such a plethora of useful information and so incredibly helpful. So I'm very sad to hear of his passing. Obviously a huge blow to the typewriter community. Those videos are still out there. It is still a great resource for anybody watching this who needs help repairing their typewriter. So very unfortunate news. I'm very saddened to hear about it, but I didn't want to remove it because Duane deserves to be remembered. And obviously he made such an impact that he was even in these manuals. So I just wanted to give some context there and let you know that I do know this, and it is context-wise around the time of that information. So let's go back to the video. Okay, the next one I read was Lewis. This was very similar to Keys, and it starts with this concept about appreciating the analog process and appreciating the sound of typewriter keys, which when you read it from the perspective of expecting this to be a machine, it's kind of weird. Because people who collect typewriters will mention that process of being able to disconnect and write, and the feel and the tactile nature of working on a typewriter. But to hear a robot quote that, it doesn't feel as genuine. So that stood out to me in the first section of the book. Again, they had an emphasis on workspace and tools. Not super comprehensive, but both Lewis and Keys do provide you with like a task list or a checklist of things. And in general, there's just a lot of oversimplification in this one specifically. There are 2 paragraphs on escapement, repair, and adjusting. And by paragraphs, I mean a couple sentences in their paragraphs. There was one on escapement timing, which I know nothing about, but that doesn't seem like enough. It does mention the typewriter forum or typewriter talk, which I did not know existed. I did go and find it later. I don't know how prevalent that is in the community. If you guys use the typewriter forum or typewriter talk, let me know down below. This is the first time I've heard of it. The next one that I read was Whitfield. Both Lewis and Whitfield do start with a brief history of typewriters, a little bit of a section to give you some sort of general knowledge about where typewriters start. Chapter 5 outlines what tips are best for beginner typewriters, mostly about collecting to help you make buying decisions. But it doesn't list any examples of what it's talking about, so it'll mention things like there are machines that are very common. You have your rarer models, you have your collector-loved models, but it can't specifically give you an example. And I think that's a bit of an oversight. Even if this is written by a person, I feel like providing some sort of specific example gives someone a direction to at least start. This one, the Whitfield one, was definitely more about an overview of typewriter usage and light cleaning rather than specific repair. So that did stand out a little bit to me as well. In this sea of manuals that promise you a step-by-step guide for how to repair your typewriter and provide very little detail for how to do it, this did stand out a little bit because it was more about the experience of buying a machine and having it in your collection. I then went to Parker, which also starts with a bit of a history of the machines and brands. This one was probably the shortest one that I read. Now on Kindle, you don't get an accurate page number because you can change the font size, how many columns, but they do have pages listed on the listings for the actual physical manuals that you could buy. This one also has info for creating a diverse collection. I think if you are making a manual or a book for typewriter collectors, that's an interesting thing to think about. I highly recommend Joe Van Cleve's video on his Desert Island typewriters. I will link that down below. When you're talking about diversity in a collection, you're not just talking about different shapes and colors and sizes. You're talking about font types, manual versus electric, size types. I think that's an interesting thing to include in a collector's guide, so that stood out to me, and it's more about cultivating a collection than it is specifically typewriter repair, very similar to the one previously. There is a very brief section on repair, and it just outlines the basics, again, without much detail or any diagrams. It also mentions some online resources that might be helpful to you. I did check this section in all of the manuals because when I used ChatGPT, I noticed that it would cite information, but that information didn't exist, or that source that it used didn't exist. So things like misnaming Jot and Tittle typewriter, that stood out to me immediately as some sort of AI because it got part of it, but that's not actually the title of it. So I did check all of these sections in the books just to see what they would suggest as useful to the typewriter community. So they did mention Duane as well as Typewriter Justice, also a fantastic resource. It also mentioned the Oz Typewriter blog, which I was so happy to see because I use that personally as a historical reference and resource all the time. Fantastic content on that, so that was great to see. It mentions an antique typewriter collector's website. I tried to find this, and as far as I could tell, that's not a thing. If they mean the Facebook group, they didn't say that. So when I'm talking about the Antique Typewriters Collectors Facebook group, it is a group on Facebook that you can join and meet other typewriter collectors. It also mentions online courses. So I did look up the online course that it specifically listed to see if that was an online course on typewriter repair that I could take, and the only one under that name that I could find was some sort of computer cleaning that was mentioned on the website. And while I was doing that, I did find a fantastic resource, which I will link down for you below. It is a PDF of a take-home repair guide from Richard Polt's website. It's one of the old ones that he scanned and put on there. So that is much more in-depth. It also states in the beginning that this take-home repair guide will not turn you into a repair tech, but it gives you a basic overview, and it is 4 times longer than any of these. It also has diagrams and pictures and steps. It's much more useful than any of these. And so to compare the two of those to each other, I found that to be a much more useful resource. I've also used War Department manuals as well, which they would send out with the typewriters so you could service them yourself when there wasn't a typewriter repair tech there. Those have been really useful for me, but the main reason I use them is because of the diagrams. I can look at that diagram and match it to the machine that I have and see if there's something that just looks wrong in the machine that I have, or if I'm missing something. And I do think that that is a deficit in all of these manuals. Speaking of diagrams, the last one I reviewed was Coleman's book, and he specifically mentioned that he did not use diagrams on purpose because he wanted to give clear and simple instructions for how to do these things without overcomplicating it. So at least he gives a reason for not using them. This was also very similar to the others where it starts off by explaining the mechanical process and the sound of a typewriter as a way to get into why you would pick up a typewriter or a machine. It does mention that the Underwood 5 is very collectible. I saw the Underwood 5 mentioned in quite a few different books. That makes sense. It's one of the highest selling typewriters that was ever made, so it makes sense that it is referenced in all of these. Here's a quote: "A well-prepared restorer doesn't just dive in." Again, I can't speak to that because sometimes I start projects without knowing what I'm doing. Insert IBM series here. So when I'm talking about oversimplification, these two things stood out to me. Chapter 4 is one singular page. Again, this is in Kindle, but it is one page, as is Chapter 5, which covers step-by-step cleaning. So your step-by-step cleaning is a singular page. It also mentions the typewriter database, again, a great resource. And it has a chart for troubleshooting. I do think this is a useful thing to have. A few of them had this, where it says, okay, faint ribbon, try this. Type bar not working, try this. So I thought that was a good thing to bring up. I will say one glaring note that stood out to me in a few of these, because there were at least 2 that mentioned this. 2 of the typewriter manuals mentioned that you could oil your type bars. So when they're going through the repair process and they're talking about sticky keys, one thing they mention is that you can clean those keys in the basket and then you can lightly oil them. All of these manuals mention that you will use light oil in your work, and I have learned to use that on rails specifically. But one thing I definitely know you're not supposed to do is oil the pivot points of your type bars in that type basket, that segment section, because that is where oil, dust, dirt is going to collect, and that causes the sticky key problem. So at least 2 of these, I believe it was Keys, had this mentioned in there, as well as Aldridge recommended cleaning type bars and applying oil to pivot points. Here's some resources I found on the internet about why you're not supposed to do that. Now, if you are prompting an AI bot to write your book for you and it puts that in your typewriter repair manual, you might not know any different, that you're not supposed to do that. If it moves, put oil on it. That makes sense to me. So it might not be something that they know to look for, but as somebody who definitely knows that's not what I'm supposed to be doing, that stands out as a little bit of a glaring flag. Okay, is that all of them? So those are some thoughts I had throughout reading all of these. Again, very nitpicky, but I want you to know what kind of content is in these, because if they are AI generated, it doesn't cover enough, and if they're not AI generated, they might not be the most useful resource to you. I have linked below a ton of helpful resources for beginners and some not so beginners. So any of the resources that were mentioned in these books, I've linked their correct information below, as well as some other ones that I think were missed and are also super useful. But that's not all. As I was reading through these manuals, novels, lists, I also discovered that Amazon was taking some action against some of these titles. So someone from Facebook saw my post and texted me personally and said, "What project are you working on?" I mentioned I was looking at some AI generated manuals. I went to my Amazon list to send them some screenshots so they could see which ones I was reading. And as I was scrolling through the list, at least 2 of the titles had been removed from Amazon just from downloading them 2 days prior. I didn't know why this was. I thought that was kind of odd. I was glad I bought the Kindle version because at least I would have them. The 2 that were removed were Lewis and Keys. The other ones were still up at the time of filming this, so those were removed. And I was curious if that was an Amazon thing or if the author had pulled them. I did a little bit more research, and Amazon has a zero tolerance policy for publishing any books on Amazon that are AI generated without disclosing that they are AI generated. So if you put an AI text on there, you have to disclose in the description as well as the text that it is AI generated. And my personal thought is maybe that's why these 2 were removed, because they were so clearly AI generated. Amazon removed them for not dictating that or notating that in their description. So I went and figured out how you could report AI generated content on Amazon, and I did do that for the other texts.
Hey, editing me again. Coleman has also just been removed.
Whitfield has just been removed, so that's 2 days more since the last one. We're making progress.
With that in mind, let's go to our subscriber show and tell. What do you guys have to say about today's subscriber show and tell? Lippy, anything to add? Please don't fight. Today's subscriber show and tell is submitted by Alex, who shared with me this Classic 12 that has a script typeface. One thing Alex loves about this typewriter is that it's Canadian made. Thanks so much, Alex. I am curious to see what your thoughts are on these texts or the process, and also if you know of any other super helpful resources for beginners to get into typewriter repair, please share them down below so that if someone randomly finds this video, they have lots of resources. I think that's the best thing the typewriter community can do, is catalog how we do these things and share them and make them accessible so that it doesn't have to be that big, scary, intimidating process. Or if it is a big, scary, intimidating process, there's at least some help out there for them and they're not in it alone or completely reliant upon an AI bot to help them out of the hole that they're in. If you like content like this, there are some other videos on this YouTube channel, as well as on my Instagram at just.my.typewriter. And I thank you all so much for watching and remind you that you're just my typewriter.